Hello. This lecture begins a series of lectures that will present Buddhist philosophy. Let us begin by considering who the Buddha was. So he lived during the 5th century, and the dates aren't exact of when he lived because it's a long time ago, and that's difficult to figure out, and there's different accounts, but roughly the 5th century, which is roughly contemporaneous with the development of philosophy in the West, in ancient Greece and ancient Athens in particular. Now, the Buddha wasn't born the Buddha. Rather, he became the Buddha. And what I want to do now is explain that transformation. So he was born Siddhartha Gautama. And according to a legend, he was born as a prince. And this legend goes that he had an immaculate conception, so he wasn't born in sort of the usual way. And there's also this sort of prophecy when he's born that he's either going to become a Buddha or a world monarch, so someone that's in charge of running things in the world. And basically what the king does is he wants his son to become this world monarch or king. And so he needs to do what he can to ensure that that happens. And what is that? Well, according to the prophecy, if he sees suffering in the world, then he will not become a world monarch, but will instead become a Buddha. And what that means we'll get to in a bit. So that's what motivates the father to shelter or seclude his son in the household to prevent him from seeing suffering out there in the world. He grows a little bit older, he even marries, has a son of his own, and he does all that without really going out in the world and seeing much. But eventually, he does see things in the world. He goes out in 4 successive days, and he sees a few different sights. And so these were the sights prophesied. So what does he see? He sees on one day an old person, on another day a sick person, on the 3rd day a corpse, on the 4th day a wandering renunciate. That is to say, someone that's renounced the various trappings of the sort of civilized world, various worldly pleasures and goods. And so by seeing those first 3 things, he realizes that suffering exists in the world because all of those are instances of suffering. And he wasn't really aware of suffering before this. And he also sees with that 4th sight, the wandering renunciate, he sees that there's a possible way out of suffering. And so this inspires him to take a different path than being a king. So he sees the problem, suffering, and he sees a possible way out, renouncing sort of worldly possessions. Now, that story is likely a myth, but it sort of exaggerates what more likely happened, which is that he did come to recognize suffering as a problem and recognized a way out, and he did, go down this path of becoming a wandering renunciate. But it's probably not likely that he was an actual prince or anything like that. In any case, according to the story, he goes and joins the other wandering renunciates and gives up worldly pleasures, but he doesn't really make much progress, and eventually he goes to a fig tree and meditates at the fig tree for what's said to be 49 days. And he meditates there, and he comes to various realizations. In particular, what we'll talk about, the 4 noble truths. So he comes to these realizations, and that's what makes him enlightened. He becomes the Buddha. And then he decides that he needs to teach others these important truths, which are a way of dealing with suffering. Now, the Buddha's thought is recorded in sutras. A sutra literally means a thread, and this is common to many Indian philosophical or religious traditions, and it's basically a series of aphorisms, collecting various sayings, dialogues, those sorts of things, and people collect them together as sort of a woven fabric, so woven threads together. And so just like Socrates, we don't have anything written by the Buddha, but rather what we know of his thought is communicated indirectly. So the next few lectures will be drawing on some of those sutras to explain his thought. But before we get to that, let us consider some of the background that sets up his thought, because he's responding to key ideas in India at the time. In particular, he's responding to the traditional Vedic religion of Brahmanism. Now, the Vedas were key texts of religious and sometimes philosophical thought that eventually led to the development of Hinduism. Now, there are a variety of texts there, and perhaps the most notable one is the Upanishads, but there are also texts such as the Kama Sutra. And that might be surprising, but what's going on here is that the Vedas present different kinds of life, different kinds of goals in life that you might seek, and explains how you achieve those different goals. So one goal is sensual pleasure, which is what the Kama Sutra focuses on. Then there's like material wealth and power that is going to be focused on by other sutras. And then there's finally virtue and social renown. And so that's what's called the Dharma. And that's a term that the Buddha himself will adopt. And so each of these texts will present a way of achieving a certain kind of life, achieving a certain goal that you might adopt. So one thing that the Buddha is doing is saying that the goals offered by the Vedas are not satisfactory because they don't really respond to the key problem that needs to be responded to, namely the problem of suffering, which we'll come back to in a bit. But it's also worth noting the difference in the authority between the Vedas and what the Buddha says. The Vedas were thought to be of supernatural origin, to have come from the gods, whereas what the Buddha teaches is something that the Buddha acquires through experience and through reasoning. And so it's accessible by anyone. Anyone, you don't even need to have the specific text. As long as you rely on your own experience and your own reasoning, and you do so correctly, you'll come to the conclusions that the Buddha has come to. Now, in the Vedic tradition, one thing that's developed is the doctrine of karma and rebirth. And this doctrine is something that the Buddha will accept, but he will reject an accompanying view of the self. He's not going to go along with it because of a certain problem, and that problem with the doctrine of karma and rebirth I'll present now. So what is the doctrine of karma? Well, it's basically that every action has consequences, and has consequences as a matter of a causal or natural law. So if you perform a good action, this will cause future good consequences. And if you do something bad, well, that's going to cause future bad consequences. But the specific nature of those consequences is distinctive. Namely, it's going to be of consequence for your next life. So after you die, you are going to be reborn and reincarnated in some manner. And if you lived well in the previous life, then you'll have a good rebirth. If you lived poorly in a previous life, you'll have a bad rebirth. So one of the goals in the Vedic tradition is to do good things in order to have a better rebirth. Now, one thing to note here is that karma and the consequences that result from it are not something governed by some supernatural entity. So it's not like God is deciding because of your bad actions to do bad things to you. No, it's more like this is a law that's kind of woven into the fabric of the universe, just like there are laws of cause and effect. So that's the doctrine. But the doctrine raises a problem for some, which is, how can you get genuine satisfaction or salvation if you are going to be constantly reborn to infinity? The fact that rebirth goes to infinity seems to be unsatisfactory to some because you don't really get any sense of completion or a genuine meaning to your action. So if you're familiar with the myth of Sisyphus from ancient Greek mythology, then you'll recognize what's similar here. Namely, you're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Now, here you're going to be doing some different things in each life, but ultimately, You're having to go through all the motions of life, be born, having to grow up, having to figure out how to live in the world, and then you die, and then you have to do it over and over and over and again. And that seems really unsatisfactory. And so what resulted were these wandering renunciants that I mentioned earlier. These are people that give up worldly goods and try to figure out the best way to live and the best way to respond to this problem. And there's many different responses, but some of the responses really include the thought that we need to get better knowledge or insight into what we are, into our true nature, the nature of the self, for example. So it's those people that the Buddha went to go follow and study with to see if he could solve the problem of suffering, which is really amplified by the doctrine of karma and rebirth. So what the Buddha recognizes is that if life is full of suffering, and we're just going to be reborn into another life that's also going to be filled with suffering, then we're condemned to lives of suffering for eternity. So how are we to respond to this problem? Well, the ascetic response of some of these wandering renunciates is to seek liberation from that cycle of karma and rebirth. So you want to liberate the self and have that self be removed or excised from that cycle and not have to undergo it. And then you might ask, well, where does the self go in that case? Well, it's going to be different on different accounts here, and we're not so concerned with it. What's important here is that that ascetic response wants to hold on to a notion of the self, a self that is removed from that cycle and then go somewhere else. But the Buddhist response, although it's sometimes talked about in terms of liberation from suffering, there's a better way to talk about it, which is extinction. The Buddhist response is going to say that we need to extinguish the self, get rid of the self, and then you might say there's nothing to be reborn, and so you don't undergo that cycle anymore. We'll be talking more about this response in a future lecture, but let us conclude by seeing how philosophy is part of the Buddha's method for figuring out how to respond to the problems in the Vedic tradition. So it's important to note here that Buddhism is not so much a religion as a philosophical view. Now, certainly there are religious aspects, and in particular, it's a soteriology. What's a soteriology? It's a kind of fancy word, but that just means a doctrine of salvation, a teaching about how we can save ourselves. And so that's really common to many religions, is the question of how we can save our souls. So that's what Buddhism is doing. It wants to offer a salvation from suffering, for example. But what that leads to is asking various philosophical questions of ethics. But those ethical questions also then lead to other kinds of philosophical questions. What is the self that needs to be saved, or is there a self that needs to be saved? So a metaphysical question about the nature of things, whether there's a self and what is its nature, as well as what is the nature of the world or the universe. Later, Buddhist philosophers will develop views in epistemology concerning how we can know various things. So it's clear that Buddhism shares a lot of topics with traditional Western philosophy, but also shares some of the same methods. As I said earlier, the Buddha relied on his own experiences to develop his views, and it's really through reflecting on those experiences and using arguments that he develops his theses. And that's philosophical because he's not relying on divine or revealed truths. Rather, these truths are something that we can access through reasoning. Finally, philosophy is of fundamental importance to the Buddha because he thinks that you need to engage in this reflection on your experience as part of the good life. So it's not something that's merely taking a detached perspective on what the self is and whether there's a self and how we should live our lives. It's rather going to inform the proper way to live, and you need to do philosophy in order to live well. So the Buddha would agree with Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, to conclude this introduction to Buddhist philosophy, I just want to note where we're going to go. The next lectures will focus in turn on the so-called Four Noble Truths, the key doctrines of Buddhist philosophy, focusing in particular on the nature of suffering and the metaphysical conception that's behind it. And then we'll turn to some arguments against the self. And then finally, we'll conclude with some ethical consequences of these metaphysical views.